Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight in person and via Zoom. Our director, Kate Marquette, is very sorry that she cannot join us tonight as she's away on Hillwood business. My name is Wilfried Seisler. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator here at Hillwood, and I'm delighted to fill in for Kate tonight and introduce our guest. As we begin, I would like to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge the Nacotchtank, also documented as the Anacostia, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey, the native peoples on whose ancestral lands Hillwood stands, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their homes near us today. For those of you joining via Zoom, please make yourself comfortable. Your cameras and microphones are not active. Submit questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom menu when they cross your mind, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the program. For those of you in the theater, I will just show you something. So please silence your devices. Thank you very much for your cooperation. As many of you know, we close for a few weeks in each January. So February at Hillwood is a fresh start here. Everything sparkles after our deep cleaning, and we are greeted by fantastic programs and a new exhibition. Next weekend, we will open Determined Women, which will explore women artists, collectors, and designers represented in Hillwood's collection. These women set an example for Marjorie Post, our founder and future woman, by making a place for themselves and overcoming obstacles through their determination to succeed. This coming Tuesday, you can get a sneak peek to our exhibition and celebrate Valentine's Day with Her Art's Desire, an event where you can enjoy delicious hors d'oeuvres, desserts, drinks, and bid on exclusive items in a silent auction. Our Valentine's event is always a wonderful time, and I can only encourage you to sponsor the evening or attending as a guest by buying tickets. Tonight begin our months-long Great and Homes and Gardens lecture series. Next week, on February 15th, Teresa Spade will discuss Black Flora, a new book about African-American farmers, florists, and other floral creatives who answered the call of the flowers, tapped into their passion, and listened to their hearts. On February 21st, Carl de la Torre celebrates the best of maximalism in a lecture based on his book, More is More is More. Yes. Ending this lecture series on March 2nd, Alex Papachristidis will present on the varied ways he makes spaces versatile to share with family and friends through his book, The Elegant Life, Rooms That Welcome and Inspire. You can, of course, learn more about these events and programs about Hillwood on our website, hillwoodmuseum.org. For those of you who are not members yet, you shouldn't wait. And I invite you to join today and make the most of your benefits this season. Tonight, we are very excited to hear from John Tschirch, who kicks off our Great Homes and Gardens lecture series with a deep dive into his book, America's Eden, Newport Landscapes Through the Ages. Please join us after the lecture for a book signing. It will be happening right outside the theater, and you can actually buy the book from the museum shop. John Tschirch is an architectural historian, writer, and teacher. His latest books include America's Eden, Newport Landscape Through the Ages, published in 2022, and Newport, the Artful City, published in 2020, which received the Victorian Society of America Book Award in 2021. John received his MA in 1986 in Architectural History and Historic Preservation from the School of Architecture of the University of Virginia. His 30-year career in the preservation and study of historic landmarks and landscapes across the globe has led him on treks to French chateaux, English castles, Italian villas, Austrian palaces, Croatian fortresses, Argentinian mansions, and the Gilded Age houses of America. I want to learn what's next. Currently, he teaches the theory and history of design at Rhode Island School of Design, advises on historic preservation projects, and is the author of several historical fiction books inspired by his travels. He is an honorary member of the Newport Garden Club and was inducted as an honorary member of the Garden Club of America in 2012 for his contributions to the research and restoration of historic landscapes. In recognition of his service to historic preservation, John received the 2013 Frederick C. Williamson Professional Leadership Award from the Rhode Island State Historic Preservation and Heritage Commission. John has lectured widely in the U.S. and abroad on architecture, landscapes, and historic cities. His work in preserving and interpreting historic places has been featured in Yale University's Encyclopedia of New England Culture, the Massachusetts Council on the Arts magazine, the Public Humanities, the magazine Antiques, Martha Stewart Living, the New York Times, and Condé Nast Traveler, and he has appeared on the A&E documentary series America's Castles. Now, please join me in welcoming John Tschirch to the podium.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and reading the entire laundry list of my life, and much appreciated. And thank you to the entire staff of Hillwood. I visited here probably 20 years ago. It was beautiful then, but I'm so impressed by the way the site has evolved. So congratulations to everyone who has been involved. This project, and let me bring the first image up, the Eden of America, Newport's landscapes through the ages. I was asked to speak specifically about the 19th and early 20th centuries in Newport, but if we think of determined women and that theme going on here, this photograph of the Rose Arbor of Armsia Hall dates to 1914. It's a lost landscape in Newport on the bay. The photograph was taken, it's a glass lantern slide, by Frances Benjamin Johnston, was a leading pioneering photographer. She was born in Baltimore, and really she became the somewhat official photographer of the Teddy Roosevelt White House. But she also traveled about. Her collections are at the Library of Congress. So this is one of the many riches I actually had to curate on this book, because there is so much in this city in coastal Rhode Island. Let's begin. Newport is a storied place, as well as a historic place. It was founded in 1638. By dissenters from Massachusetts Bay Colony. They did not come upon a virgin wilderness. As early as 1524, Giovanni de Verrazzano had sailed into Newport Harbor. And in his letter to the King of France, Francois Ier, he wrote, the island is cultivated. And the inhabitants, who were the Narragansett tribe, who had occupied this for centuries, had deforested the landscape to cultivate. They had no permanent settlements, but they moved by the seasons. So again, an acknowledgement to the Narragansetts, who truly created the base of that landscape, that then colonial Newporters then impressed their imprint upon. Now, this image shows the Redwood Library and Athenaeum, one of the oldest libraries in America in continuous use. Newport doesn't always have the oldest, but it has the oldest in continuous use of everything, because we throw nothing away. We throw nothing away. So it is one of the first great Palladian buildings in North America. And in front of it is a fern leaf beach. Let's bring you closer into that. It was planted in 1835, and it's so ancient. Do you see how the roots have consumed the cast iron fence? I always expect some kind of nymph to pop out of that ancient hollow. But it's this sense of age, and Newport is one of those places where you cannot divorce the built environment from the natural environment. It is such a place of spectacular scenery that it defines the place. And over time, I say this is a cultural landscape. And what do we mean by that? One can use very esoteric terms, but in my simpler terms, it is a landscape that shows the hand of humankind and how we shape fields, gardens, scenes, and through that shaping, we reflect the spirits of various ages. And so Newport reads like a textbook, hopefully a romance novel, maybe, in how this is done. So here you see an 18th century building with a 19th century tree in front of it. But let's take a look at the map. If you haven't visited, Newport is on the south coast of Aquinic Island. It's a northern New England climate, but warmed by the Gulf Stream, which is so key. So you have a series of microclimates, actually. So it's not as cold as other points of New England. In the colonial period, it was said Newport was a coat warmer than Boston in winter and a coat cooler in summer. Here you see a map from 1878. You see the old colonial city on the middle of the slide right here. And the remainder of the city is the 19th century resort. Newport suffered after the Revolution as a port. It was surpassed by Boston and Providence, and so it really looked at its picturesque scenery. Bellevue Avenue, the Grand Avenue, was developed in the windswept cliffs, and then Ocean Drive by the 1860s. So here's Bellevue Avenue, and then Ocean Drive. This 19th century town was a picturesque town. It's an example of high Victorian romanticism, the notion of the emotional, evocative quality of landscape, the wild surf hitting the cliffs. And so high romanticism met the realities of real estate speculation. It was a production of two. Alfred Smith was the great real estate developer, and they said he was the king of real estate developers who produced the aristocratic avenues of Newport. Now that is branding, as we would call it today, in the 19th century, because they were appealing to a very wealthy audience. And so the cottage boom was on. And with the cottage boom came the garden boom. And that's what we'll look at. Now, if we just take a little bit of the south coast of the city, you'll see this first cove on the right. That's Bailey's Beach. Mr. Bailey was one of the real estate speculators, and that would become the posh beach. The houses around it on the right, you see Ocean Drive isn't even there yet. This is 1860. Ocean Drive would come in 1867. All of these houses had the right to collect seaweed from the beach. That went back to farming days when seaweed was used as fertilizer, and it's still in the deeds. And then you have the rocky coves. Now, do you notice Almy Pond, then Lily Pond? These are hills in between each one. So in the evening, the mist comes up and mists each of those valleys. So you can have very verdant green lawns. You can propagate certain plant species, but oftentimes on the far left, on one side of these granite outcroppings left behind by the Wisconsin period, when again the Ice Age was retreating, it's very rare on the New England coast. The New England coast is quite flat. Then all of a sudden in Newport, you have these massive rock cliffs in a pink-gray granite. They're called glacial erratics, and I worked in Newport long enough that I knew some glacial erratics in human form. I must tell you, I did. However, one side of a glacial erratic will be like a desert, rock face. The other side will be a verdant valley. So it provided both challenges and opportunities for landscape architects. Then the artists came. I'm always interested, both in my teaching and my writing, about half of it is the physical record, the thing we're looking at, the landscape, the building. The other half that I think is so important is the role of the artist, the photographer, the poet, the painter, because they mythologize the place. They're the ones who made Newport a storied place. By the 1850s and 60s and 70s, the leading American luminist painters were coming to Newport in the summertime. They were in the Hudson River, of course, but they also came here. This is a view of Almy Pond and the ocean beyond it by John Frederick Kensett. And literally, that's the pond. He's standing at the top, looking down. It is an Edenic image. And why do I call the book America's Eden? I didn't invent it. In the first geography of the United States in 1789, Jedediah Morse wrote of Aquidneck Island, Newport, and its environs. He said, the travelers with propriety love the climate. It's gentle and healthful. It is justly called the Eden of America. It's this Edenic image. Now, this is a Western European concept imposed on the landscape of a new world. And we'll see how many generations interpreted this. But if you know the ever-changing, eternal sunshine, the lush valley, the fattened cattle, the land of abundance, the land of milk and honey. That's what Kensett is capturing here. In the meadowlands left behind, really, first by the Narragansetts, and then by the colonials who raised livestock in this part of town, who also deforested it. But then, the hand of humankind began to reshape it. Now, this happens to be a photograph from the 1970s, but I want to show you the complete regrading of the lawn at Clarendon Court. And then to the right is a Victorian house, Beaulieu, from 1857. That's Bellevue Avenue in front of them, and then Almy Pond in the back. But you see the reshaping of the land, regrading, shaping, designing. But let's think of the first bit of land that became a conscious green space. This is a very rare painting of Newport in 1818. It's very rare to find painted views of American cities in general. And here you see the magnificent brick market building right in the center of the photograph of 1762, the great mercantile house and Long Wharf. So this was the main entrance to the city. On the left-hand side of the slide was a drill ground, a military parade ground that became a proper park in the early 1800s. And it's lined with trees. Well, the early urban tree in America in the Northeast was the elm, the stately columnar elm. Well, that can't prove they're elms, but this can. A photograph only taken 30 years later, the 1860s, showing the stately elms on what was then named Washington Square after the Revolution. So elms begin to line the city streets, and that was a trend throughout America. The writer, Andrew Jackson Downing, who was the tastemaker in mid-19th century America through his writings, both on houses and landscapes, he was a bit of a Victorian zealot, you know. They were repressed, you have to release it somehow. So he released it by talking about the eminent power of nature. And he said we should all become apostles of taste, and say we must plant cathedrals of elms. But he was very convincing. Everyone read him. And of course, that idea of Newport as a picturesque enclave begins with the creation of this. This is Bellevue Avenue, laid out in 1854. The old hotel on the right, that would burn to the ground in 1895, and the hotel would not come to define Newport, the private house and its garden would. This is called The Drive, featured in Harper's Magazine. So this was not a secluded resort. This was a place to, see and be seen. And Newport was a place, though, these picturesque houses, I call them, to both reveal and conceal, to tempt and to taunt. And here we see one of the first parks. Bellevue Avenue was laid out in 1853. Then here, Toro Park, 1854. They didn't choose just an open piece of ground, though. Newport was already being thought of as historic. Had to become historic sometime, about a century after. Right? It wasn't historic in the 18th century. But in the 1850s, Longfellow wrote a poem about the old Jewish burying ground at Newport, and all of a sudden, this tower becomes the centerpiece of a park called Toro Park. It's on an original surviving parcel of land they acquired, which was an 18th century farm. And then the tower, they thought, was built by the Vikings. Well, that was a Victorian romantic notion, but it's Newport's first sightseeing attraction. And it was the idea that it was America's Stonehenge. It's been found to have been a 17th century grinding mill. But here you see it featured in Harper's Magazine with people taking their perambulations, you know, in the afternoon. So the idea that Newport was scenic and historic by the mid-19th century. And then you have the cottage boom. I'm showing you some vintage images. This is the first summer cottage on Bellevue Avenue. It predates the avenue, 1841. This is an 1870 image of it. It was owned by the Jones family of Georgia and then transferred to the King family of Newport. And there you see David King, his wife and daughter, sitting on the steps. It's by the architect Richard Upjohn, and Newport becomes a living laboratory of the American architecture profession at this time. You know, to receive a commission here for house, interior, garden, made a reputation. Upjohn would design this in 1841, the picturesque vine-covered Gothic Revival cottage. He would then the next year go on to redesign Trinity Church on Wall Street, the trophy project, and he would become the first president of the American Institute of Architects in 1857. So this was a cultural colony as well as a summer fashionable colony. This wonderful Gothic Revival, look at how they've broken the classical box. Towers, gables, trellises. This was the template for the picturesque. Here is the Reefs. Now this burnt to the ground in the 1940s. It eventually became the home of Cornelius Vanderbilt's daughter, who would become Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney from the Whitney Museum. But she summered here. But here it is from the 1850s, and John Collins produced these prints of every new house being built. And they were sold. Everything here is what Downing would have said was a picturesque landscape. There's not a straight line to be seen, number one. The perambulating paths. Also, it is a landscape where you don't want your silk slippers or leather shoes to be stained by grass. You know, you want to see the sweeping views of wild nature, but from the comfort of the veranda and the path. And this specifically would be found as picturesque because of the pointed evergreen trees mixed in with the deciduous trees. And also, do you see the small beds of flowers along the pathways? Downing himself was a horticulturist, and he was a nursery owner in the Hudson River Valley. In the 1840s and 50s, when he was writing, the nursery business was a new burgeoning industry. The notion of the American home, the independent home with its garden, was literally being solidified for many as the American dream. And so nursery owners are catering to these small flower beds, you see, and it's a social garden with people gathered about. And of course, to be embowered in trees was everything. This is a photograph of Bel Air, one of the grand Victorian summer houses. This is their rustic tree house. Photograph again from 1870 with people literally embowered in the greenery. And this is a house that is lost. I like to include both lost houses. Again, I must say, Newport is one of the most historically intact communities in the United States. So when I show lost elements, they're few, but they're important to think about. This is Linden Gate, which is the home of Henry Marquand of New York, who was chairman of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Collections Committee. The house is by Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to be educated in Paris. It's what he would call a chalet normand. It was the chic type of medieval revival house you saw all along the French resort coast from Biarritz to Deauville. Here you see it. Here's the house with its magnificent slate tiles and the new plantings of trees. There are oak trees, and then right at the bottom on the left, a tub of hydrangea. Besides the refined cottages in picturesque style, genteel dwellers did go out to see Newport's more rustic landscape. These are Victorian sightseers, corseted, top-hatted, parasoled, going out to see Purgatory Chasm, which nowadays is in Middletown, Rhode Island, but it was in Newport at the time. The writer George Champlin Mason, who was a Newporter, really championed the building of these avenues and saw the future of Newport as this center for picturesque scenery and resort life, had said, in Newport, you see there's Purgatory here, and then beyond it is Paradise Valley. He said, always a good Christian has to pass from Purgatory to reach Paradise. Edenic imagery, indeed. But of course, the glacial erratics were fascinating. There was a George Gordon King, a member of the Summer Colony, and they founded the Geological Society with many prominent geologists on it. He said, we can't just succumb to watering place trivialities. So they were an intellectual group who studied the rock formations of Newport in their Victorian garb. And speaking of glacial erratics, the artists were also drawn to this. This is Beacon Rock in Newport Harbor. And this painting is by John Frederick Kensett from 1857. Later, in 1890, McKim, Mead, and White, the architects, would build a magnificent house on this setting. This painting is at the National Gallery of Art here in Washington. He really was chasing what Henry James called the chastened light of Newport, this very soft coastal light. There's always a gentle filter or a bit of a haze, even on a clear day. And so this is what attracted the luminous painters, is the ever-changing light you find on the coast. And remember, it's not just one coastline. One side of Newport is a bay, one side is an ocean, one side is the Sakonnet River Passage. And there are coastal ponds and hills. So you can walk across the city and find several different horticultural zones, ecozones, microclimates, and lighting conditions in the same day. Now, writers and artists also came besides the painters. Harriet Beecher Stowe paid a call to Newport. In 1859, she published a book called The Minister's Wooing. It's about a young girl named Mary who lives in an apple orchard with her aunt. She's the image of virginal purity. Her lover, James Marvin, is at sea. Harriet Beecher Stowe literally used the landscape of Newport as a character or characters in this book, because James Marvin was as solid as the granite and as forceful as the sea, that Mary would go out and sit upon the rocks and think about where the true love of her life was. She was the pastoral landscape, nurturing, gentle, fertile. He was the powerful seagoer. But there's a moment when she's invited to a party at a Newport cottage. And there she found all the evils and temptations of the world. while wearing a rose-bedecked dress. And the minister was the one she had to watch out for. I won't spoil it. But for example, this really brings to life the house she came to visit. This is called Gravel Court. I show it to you in book form. George Champlin Mason, again, who is the champion of the resort, published this book in 1875. It featured all of the various Newport cottages and their landscape. Look at this Victorian dressing on the front steps. You have yucca on the top, urns. See on the roof, the balustrade? You have trumpet vine actually growing on the porch because it's very tough. It does well in Newport's seaside climate. And then you have geraniums and ferns. And these are the brilliant sort of electric colors, fire engine red geraniums, pink geraniums, rich blue hydrangea, which love the climate of Newport. And this is who provided them. Newport had two famous greenhouses. Here you see Hodgson's. Now, Hodgson was a bit of an interloper. Galvin and Sons was established in 1854 to quote-unquote supply practical gardening elements to Newport houses. Hodgson was a New Yorker and had a New York shop and then opened this shop on fashionable Bellevue Avenue, whereas Galvin was downtown. Hodgson had 8 greenhouses. Hodgson did party decorations as well, so he'd supply everything to you. Galvin would store your things in the winter. He would store your fuchsia, your geranium, your ferns, maidenhair fern, so his account books still survive, and they are backup for these electric colors I'm speaking of. Now that would change in the 1880s. This genteel period of these delicate little flower beds was from about 1840 to 1880. We'll see what happens later. Here's the image of this very fashionable shop. Here's the real thing in photographic form. Now what's interesting is Hodgson had the greenhouses in back, his studio upstairs, but on the first floor he had a very chic photographer called Campbell, and so all of the society ladies would have their photographs taken, and do you notice their photographs were hanging literally on the street? So you could ride by in your car and say, there I am. There's my daughter. She's coming out this season. And Mrs. Astor was known to stop here, the leader of the resort, and have a carnation put in her carriage vial every day. Well, let's take a look at a house that shows an evolution in Newport. This is called Chateau-sur-Mer, and it was built by a China trade merchant in 1852, William Shepherd Wetmore. He retired at the age of 42. His wife was from a prominent Salem family, the Darby family. She was 17. She had a nervous breakdown a few years after. We don't know why. Now, local lore, of which Newport is rife, and I'm afraid I destroyed a lot of it because I would look for things like footnotes and primary documents. Most likely, the poor thing was bipolar, and she lived in Boston the rest of her life. But legend had it that she ran off with a coachman who dumped her in Baden-Baden, so that's a better story, but I don't think it's true. He died shortly thereafter, Mr. Wetmore, and it was left to his son, who then was very much raised as the scion of a new dynasty. He went to Paris. He left the house in the hands of Richard Morris Hunt in the 1870s. By 1880, this was the house they had. It had transformed from a Victorian cottage to a French chateau with the soaring tower, the porte cochere, and here you see the gardener, Robert Christie, with his dog to the right, and 2 gardeners behind him. This house would evolve over time. Here's the windswept meadow when they owned 35 acres with the moon gate looking to the sea. Now in China, a moon gate is usually a round entrance to an enclosed courtyard. Here it's reverse. It's a Western interpretation looking out to the sea with hydrangea around it. But here is now the house fully planted. That is a weeping beech on the far left. They had a magnolia from Mongolia, blue atlas cedar, all varieties of beech tree, London plane trees. This truly was an arboretum in the 1880s, and that was the new landscape. Your house was to be a museum of trees. And Andrew Jackson Downing used the word arboretum. He modeled it after John Claudius Loudon, a prominent British writer who said an arboretum is the thing. It's both an aesthetic experience, but also a scientific arrangement of trees. And this is the living evidence of that. That beech tree is still with us, by the way, on the left. Here it is, but this is from 1920. This is a hand-painted photograph by Edward Van Altena, which is in the Smithsonian collection. It's in the Archives of American Gardens, donated by the Garden Club of America. So it's the beech tree now. It's 1920. It's 40 years old at this point. And trees have to be moved. This is Jimmy the tree mover Martin, who moved trees of 20 to 40 feet in height because people wanted their landscapes today, not to wait too long. They had patience. So the moving of trees, again, in this windswept area. At Chateau-sur-Mer, we have the original photos of the greenhouses. Now, there's the palm house on the left, just to winter over palms. You know, really this one of the signature plants of the Victorian age. And think of it, the steamship, the traveling glass case helped with the speed of importing things from South America, from Africa, from all continents of the globe. And on the right is the greenhouse itself. Now, here's the entrance gate. Richard Morris Hunt designed these two Egyptian Revival style gate posts. Olmsted brothers, the sons of Frederick Law Olmsted, designed the entrance. All of the plantings are still intact. That is an Irish yew on the left. Let me bring you through. When you drive into that gate, if you turn to the left today, this is what you see, a weeping hemlock. It's a magnificent specimen. Once you drive by it, there are rhododendrons. The house is revealed, it's concealed again. The house is revealed, it's concealed as you wind your way on this curving driveway. Here is one of the Turkish oaks you see from the 1850s, and then a weeping beech from the 1880s. So you see, to me, this tree reads like some ancient dinosaur. You know, it's so magnificent. And in Newport, we call them living legends. Again, set in this verdant lawn. Well, the tree was such an iconic image that in 1874, while Chateau-sur-Mer is being planted, the architect Charles Fallon McKim of McKim, Mead and White, he was the third American to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, prominent architect in Newport and New York, of course. He was one of the earliest architects to commission photographs of colonial buildings, and they were all in Newport. His colonial building photographs are celebrated, but people forget there's one landscape photo as well. This was an apple orchard. And of course, it's 1872, and it's about a century old. So he said, I'm looking at a colonial apple orchard. And if you're going to have an American Eden, you need your apple orchard. Now let's turn to the southern part of the island. This is the area that will become Ocean Drive. I had shown you the map of this by George Champlin Mason. This is 1857. It's still at the Redwood Library today. It is a portent of the future. You see the deforested landscape. Great opportunities for the landscape designer. Some looked at it with aesthetic delectation. Others looked at it as desolate. But the drive went through. But here you see sheep on the right, the things that used to be there of the past. On the left, barely make them out, Victorian sightseers. That's the way of the future. And here's the drive. They did not blast through. They respected the natural topography and the picturesque views from this. And the entire southern portion of the island really develops in the late 1870s and 80s and is a more rustic version of the picturesque. No more gentle little garden beds. They wouldn't survive out here. And we'll see how things evolve. Here's a view. You see the glacial erratics with no trees. The building on the far left is by Richard Morris Hunt, and the landscape by Frederick Law Olmsted himself. Frederick did 4 sites in Newport, and his sons, as Olmsted brothers, did 31 sites. So they had a major influence on shaping the landscape. So there's the house today. It was designed for a Mr. Dorsheimer, later a Mr. Busk. Look at the way both the architect and the landscape architect sited the building within these glacial erratics. And then Frederick Law Olmsted planted succulents on the front lawn, sedum and other tough plants, and then woody plants behind in the lush protected valley. Here's a photograph the Olmsted brothers took of their father's work in 1916, 26 years after. All evergreens, rhododendrons. You come right in, there's the cliff face, then you wind around it. This has a 360-degree view of the island. And then as we continue on, another of the great picturesque landscapes is this, and houses. This is The Waves by John Russell Pope. So I paid a call in the National Gallery today, his great classical work. Here he is working in this Old English style. It's a master of craftsmanship. It literally rises out of granite outcroppings at the southernmost tip, high winds. So he created an enclosed, a walled garden. and a landscape in the manner of Gertrude Jekyll, the prominent arts and crafts designer of the time. Well, he was designing this in the 20s, but she was already well established by the early 1900s. It's an English garden, thyme growing between the paving stones, lilies on the right and left, phlox, and all the soft herbaceous borders. And here you see his original plan. I know it's hard to read in detail, but I just wanted to show you how involved he was with Olmsted Brothers. And you see that plan. There's a building at the bottom. That is his architecture studio, which looks out over the ocean. And there's his studio with a magnificent ship weather vane. These are the original photographs taken. The building is distressed gray wood, and the original slate tiles were in pale green and almost a gray lavender. And the original glass was also tinted pale green and lavender. It was this beautiful feeling. Now let's go back to Beacon Rock and see what happened. 1890, McKim and White. I see this as a pivot point in Newport, and it represents a pivot point in America. In the 1890s, you really have this resurgence of classicism again, and the picturesque being slowly somewhat left behind. You know, in the 1890s, it's interesting to think the great stone palaces were now be built in Newport to replace the earlier Victorian cottages. And it's in the 1890s when the United States surpasses Germany, Britain, and France in the production of coal, steel, and oil. We are the new empire on the rise. And the builders of Newport cottages and the grand houses of Fifth Avenue and the grand houses around DuPont Circle that I've walked about are really taking on the grandeur of the past in their houses, their French chateaux, their Italian palaces, in their portraits, modeled after Velázquez and Reynolds, you know. Really, it's a new style. And here you see this house of 1890, Beacon Rock, as it's called, by McKim and White. The back of the building is asymmetrical, made of local stone, like an Ocean Drive house. The front is now classical, with clipped bay trees and a classical Roman garden. The locals nicknamed it the Acropolis. They had to build a bridge to get to it on the right. And that heralded something new, this type of building. This is Ochre Court, 1891, right after Beacon Rock, the classical building. And I say a classical city and a classical landscape was being overlaid on a Victorian city and a picturesque landscape. See the little Victorian house up here, a little by that standards up there. 1891, Richard Morris Hunt for the Gillette family of New York. Olmsted, and Eliot did the landscape. And of course, Charles Eliot had worked with Frederick Olmsted on the Emerald Necklace plan for Boston. It was a green program, that a series of parks and green spaces that linked Boston Common with Franklin Park. Very knowledgeable. You see the straight entrance drive, the forecourt, and the tapis vert, the green carpet. That classicism. And here's the plan. You see the remnants of an earlier picturesque park around it. And then Marble House of 1892, William and Alva Vanderbilt. This is Richard Morris Hunt again, French classicism, a straight drive, and a ramp worthy of the Paris Opera. A house for display. You see now what's happened, classicism. Notice these are blue hydrangea, which line the path. But it was interesting to come upon this. You see? Everything about Mrs. Vanderbilt was built for show. So she drove automobiles when they first came out. And so she had a ladies' automobile parade where women drove cars and they were all decorated by their gardeners. So technology met flora. This is Mrs. Vanderbilt, who by that time was remarried. This is 1899. She had divorced her husband in 1895 and then married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, who lived across the street conveniently. And this was her bedecked car. In the evening, they had an illuminated car parade down Bellevue Avenue. Prior to that, though, they had an obstacle course race at her house, Belcourt, across the street from Marble House, where they had straw dummies resembling nursemaids' children and other people that they drove around. Now, because of this sense of show, Paul Bourget, who was a member of the French Academy, a good friend of the Goncourt brothers, who were the great journalists and writers of Paris at the time, he came to Newport. at this time. In early 1900s, he made friends with Edith Wharton, summering in the resort. They became aesthetic soulmates. And he said about all of this display, he said, there's just too much of everything. And he did say, the American Beauty Rose, which filled Newport Gardens, he said, is very lush, very voluptuous. He said, it's the symbol for Newport, he said, because it's lush and pampered and a little pompous and made for display. Whereas he preferred the delicate, somewhat languid eglantine. And I thought, well, he didn't get eglantine roses in Newport. He wrote about this, and then Mark Twain responded. He said, why does Paul Bourget hate us so much? All over gardens. And in Mark Twain's very sardonic essay, he said, Paul Bourget came to Newport to look for the soul of America, but for the unacclimated, Newport is impervious. And I can vouch for that, having worked there. And what Twain was also saying, he said, America was too big to define it in one way. The eclecticism of the Newport landscape was the eclecticism of America. Interesting, though, that this debate would emerge in this place. And then we come to a house Paul Bourget and Morton might have approved of. This is the Elms from 1901 by the coal baron Edward Berwind of Philadelphia. You see the picturesque landscape. The house is an 18th century French chateau that had replaced an earlier building, and then a sunken garden was produced at the very end. Let me walk you through the images. These are period photographs from 1920, hand-painted glass lantern slides. A classical green landscape, clipped greenery, a landscape that has no business growing, a landscape of clipped perfection. The beech trees are on the lawn, and yucca are in the urns. This is the urn along the garden. People say it's Zeus, but I don't think Zeus had a handlebar mustache in the urn. This is Mr. Berwind playing at being Zeus. This is the garden room at the Elms in a 1901 photograph. An entire room devoted to the garden, opening onto the garden. And the boxwood garden at the Elms, 1920 photograph. And the Grand Allée, 1920, all at the Garden Club of America, a green garden. And here, busts of the Four Seasons, à la Française, very typical amongst the lindens, which you would have had at Versailles, and the sunken garden. The garden pavilions themselves are inspired by the Belvedere and the Petit Trianon. And Pierre de Nolhac, the director of Versailles, had just published in 1906 The Gardens of Versailles, and this was designed in 1907. So you see this emerging classicism. And then Mrs. Vanderbilt would not be outdone. At Marble House, you see she had a Chinese tea house built. She knew that French chateau had their Chinese garden folly, so in 1912, she sent Richard Morris Hunt's sons on a sketching tour of southern China, and they produced this by 1913. What could have inspired this? It was a Chinese building, but it was a European concept. This is Marie Antoinette's watercolor series on the Petit Trianon. There's the Trianon on the left, and her Jeu de Bague, her chinoiserie carousel. So the idea, you see? And there's the Hunt's drawing. Based on a Sung Dynasty temple, but the idea is European, hanging on the cliffs. And this was the setting here. A garden bed of 9,000 fire engine red geraniums complemented it. And this was the setting for her Chinese costume ball in 1914. Here's Mrs. Belmont by that time, and there's Evelyn Walsh McLean wearing the Hope Diamond right there. Think about it, 1914, the war would break out soon and change this world. Garden pavilions were the order of the day. This is a colonial revival garden pavilion at a house called Berkeley Villa, 1901. This is a garden pavilion from 1920, colonial revival at Château-sur-Mer. So Newport has a rich tradition of these structures as well as paintings, literary references. And lastly, an English garden. Remember the Brown family wrote, the Olmsted brothers said, I wish to have a garden from an English fairy tale. This is their rustic stone house. There's actually a gardener mowing over here. Let's take a look. Now, I know it's hard to read the entire plan, so, but let me bring you through it. On the left is the flower garden. This is a woodland garden right out of some Elizabethan pastoral poem, Bowling Green. Let's take a look at, there are 315 plants. Here are just some. Mrs. Brown lived here year-round, so she had mountain laurel, she had vinca, ivy, and then spring flowers, daffodils, narcissi, peonies, lily of the valley, literally something out of a pastoral English poem. Here you see more of it. The level of detail, done in 1912. This is a photograph by the Olmsted brothers of the woodland garden, the lily of the valley and the ferns. Whoops, sorry. And this is, whoops, sorry about that. This is her rose garden in 1920, enclosed. And this is her garden in the 1930s in a family photograph with all the tulips, so constantly changing. And lastly, I want to end with a garden that we sometimes call the greatest garden in Newport, in some ways, built on the edge of an abyss. What do I mean by that? This is the Arthur Curtis James estate on Ocean Drive, the biggest estate in Newport, over 100 acres. Here's the main house. The house is no longer there, right there. The Olmsted brothers did the entire estate plan. Here, rose gardens nestled into the rock face. This is the highest point in Newport. It's called Beacon Hill. There was a colonial beacon on this site. Some people used to refer to it as Newport's Mount Olympus, where powerful gods dwelled. He did own the Northern Pacific Railroad, so he was in his own way. And then this was created in 1913 by their gardener, John Greatrex, and the Olmsted brothers, the Blue Garden, which, with the historicism of the age, it really did combine the idea of an Islamic garden with a narrow channel, the reflecting ponds, the aquatic garden of lotuses, but then a classical arbor at the end. And the garden was blue and white. Blue salvia, white salvia, blue iris, lavender. And it was here that Mrs. James in 1914 would stage the most lavish garden fete. It was called the Masque of the Blue Garden. And again, the Gilded Age was this period of great theatrics using history. And here it is. She hired a troupe of actors from New York to come and do a classical tableau. And so visitors came and sat in the garden, and then it exploded in blue electric light. Think of it, electric light at this time. And they posed as nymphs and satyrs, and they ran about the garden. And then all of a sudden, Mrs. James appeared and said, "Welcome to my blue garden." And then trumpeters dressed in Italian Renaissance garb came out, blew their trumpets, and people were invited into dinner. Think of it, it's on the very edge of the war, that abyss, which would change this world forever. Taxes, war, social change. But she would not be outdone. She would do one more thing in 1916. This is the Swiss village. They had been to the Ticino section of Switzerland, the Italian section. So in 1916, they hired Grosvenor Atterbury to design the Surprise Valley Farm, or Swiss village, which provided meat, poultry, chickens, a dairy for the estate. Mrs. James would actually sit on this very site in a pavilion and have her guests watch the prize cattle being brought in. And Town and Country reported that Mrs. James entertained a la Trianon, like Marie Antoinette, here in her village. And here is a photograph by Francis Benjamin Johnston of the gardeners at Beacon Hill House, and they had 10,000 pots of geraniums in the inventory, terracotta pots to propagate plants every year. And there's the Gardening Society in Newport in 1932. With over 200 summer villas, Newport had a community of over 500 gardeners who formed the Horticultural Society. So it was a community within a community, and this is where they dwelled. Here you see Ochre Court in the upper portion. Here are all of the cutting gardens. You see? And then you see these small elements. Here, whoops. Oh. Those are rose arbors. Why would you have a rose arbor in a functional cutting garden and vegetable garden? The owners gave tours of their gardens. They entertained in them. The gardeners' greenhouses had tea rooms. So this is how embedded the garden was with the great estates, with Ochre Court in the upper corner. This photograph was taken by Robert Yarnell Ritchie, who was a photographer for Life magazine National Geographic award-winning, and between 1932 and 1934, he photographed Newport. How lucky for us, because the 1938 hurricane was a cataclysmic event that devastated part of the island. Again, so much is still intact, but again, it was a fabulous record, because what you're seeing is the mature 19th century landscape in photographs that you just saw being planted. That was between 58 and 60 years old. So that's a mature vision. Olmsted once said, very few people have a vision that they can understand. He said, I have to envision it, my clients have to trust me. That it'll come to fruition. And lastly, his sons photographed the entire streetscape of the town. So they were doing private dream houses, but democratic improvements for the Improvement Association. And here you see their views of open space. And finally, Childe Hassam came, the great American impressionist, to paint the landscape here on Bailey's Beach. This is 1901. George Bellows painted a summer evening at the Newport Casino in 1920. Sort of a golden leafy dream. But Henry James was a prophet. When he looked at this cliff face, that's the Breakers, the Vanderbilt house, he said, this island where one should find shepherds piping amongst dim pillared porticos has become a breeding ground for white elephants. He wrote it in 1907. He said, someday their owners, roused from a witless dream, will wonder what in the world to be done with them. And I say nothing, let them stand there vast and blank as witnesses to affronted proportion. Dear Henry, he was right and he was wrong. What he didn't account for? Here are the shepherdesses at one of those Gilded Age parties. It is also tiring. She would awaken from that witless dream and wonder what in the world to do. These are blue mask photos, by the way. And this is what they think about. What would we do with them? The upper part here, that's a Frederick Law Olmsted landscape, demolished, 1970. The house below it, Horace Trumbauer House, a Col de Beaux-Arts landscape, demolished. And in conclusion, what would happen? Kurt Vonnegut published a novel in 1959 called The Sirens of Titan. The opening scene takes place in Newport, Rhode Island. When Malachi Constant, the richest man in the world, wants to take a flight into space, well, that happened lately, hasn't it? And he came upon the Rumford estate, a fictional estate, and stood in the broken bowl of an old fountain in a garden that had turned into New England jungle. It reminds me of this house by John Russell Pope, crumbling. This was taken by Nancy Serkis, a RISD student, in 1962, a period of great demolitions. This house would be demolished. But it would become, Newport would be seen as a place of decay and of historicism. But they didn't count for one thing. This is Christopher Tunner designing a garden for the great preservationist in town. This is a 1949 abstract expressionist garden for Mrs. George Henry Warren, who founded the Preservation Society. And notice the shrubs. They're in the shapes of question marks and semicolons. So it's a surreal garden. She was on the board of MoMA, by the way, inspired by that. Here's a classical garden that inspired it. And there's her garden scheme. It reminds me of a Juan Miró or a Matisse drawing. It's still intact, by the way. And then in 1974, she said, Newport should always be a source for the new. Let the new converse with the old. Great landscape sculptors came to Newport in 74 and staged Monumenta, a citywide exhibition of abstract art. This is the sod maze at Chateau-sur-Mer, created by Richard Fleischner in 74. There it is today. I think of Maya Lin's work at Storm King and other places. Christo wrapped Ocean Drive. Here it is. But what to do today? Well, this is the Newport Tree Conservancy. These students are propagating all of the living legends in Newport. And here they are, where I began, in front of the great beech tree. You see? Hopefully, to preserve these. Also taken by one of my students, the beech trees of Chateau-sur-Mer, so this will remain. this Edenic image, this series of chapters in a complex and layered place. So I hope you've enjoyed the sort of layered approach and the embarrassment of riches I've shown you. And I'm told we can take questions. So I believe the lights will go up, and someone, I think, has a microphone, and we'll go around with questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. We're now
We'll
going
watch
to
for
take
questions. Yes, there's someone right here in the front, and if I can hear you, I'll repeat the question.
What do you think is the best way to tour these Newport gardens and homes?
Oh, wait.
What do you think is the best way to tour these Newport gardens and homes? I think a wonderful time to visit Newport actually is in the fall because of the climate, September and early October. And I would say the elms and Chateau-sur-Mer are two of the best to see, and they're owned by the Preservation Society. And they allow you to buy a ticket for the grounds, to walk about them. And they do have an app on your phone now when you can walk around and hear about some of the trees and the landscapes. They don't always have organized tours, but it's a way to experience that. And I'd say the fall is the best because you see everything in its most mature state, especially September. Yes, front row.
What are your students doing, per se, to keep these
Oh.
alive and going?
Well, these are students who work with the Newport Tree Conservancy. Oh, what are your students doing to keep these alive? That was the question.
I mean, there is a Newport
Yes.
Conservancy for this.
Yes, the Newport Tree Conservancy has a program called the Newport Herbarium, where the high school students are working with their arborist, and they're taking samples of all of the leaves and the rootstock of Newport's living legends. They're documenting it, and it's going in an herbarium vault at Salve Regina University. They're also propagating trees in what's called the tree house, so they're using the same genetic code to literally reproduce the real tree. And they will donate these trees to worthy sites.
So they have a nursery going with all of these
They do.
trees?
They do have a nursery going for those trees. It's a Tree City USA, and Newport technically has more arboreta than any city in the world because the Tree Conservancy has accredited 16 separate sites as arboreta. They do an accreditation program for people. Your garden has to be open once a year. So Newport Tree Conservancy is a wonderful site for more information as well.
And I'm going
Questions?
to serve as the Zoom voice for just a second. We have a question in the chat, and that question is, were the cutting gardens a shared space for the cottage owners?
The cutting gardens were not a shared space. They were private spaces. The image I showed was 3 cutting gardens that happened to be adjacent. But there was such a community of gardeners. They all knew each other. They apprenticed with one another. The Vanderbilt estate, the Breakers, this Robert Gardner trained a John Allen who went on to another estate, a Robert Laurie who went on to another estate. It was a tight, close community. And I have interviews with gardeners in my landscape book. Again, I began these oral history projects around the 1990s with 90-year-olds. So an 80-year-old, so they could remember and think back from the Gilded Age right through to, let's say, the 60s. One of the last houses was 1974 that was maintained to that standard. And they verified this, which is interesting. And one man called Echo Burrows said his father worked for Mrs. Brown, and all the staff, their last name began with B. He said because she gave them the old linen. You can't make it up. But that's real. It's real history, and it humanizes it rather than people becoming just two-dimensional characters. It's the reality of it. And Mrs. Brown wrote a letter once. She said, I am so exhausted with this gardening planning, I must go to Italy. Well, and he said she wasn't doing the work, but she was tired of reading the correspondence. The mic.
Really quickly, the folks in the audience, if you could just wait for my colleague Marcia to hand you the microphone, and then please tell your answer into the microphone for the sake of people on Zoom. Thanks so much.
Sure. I'm curious about your use of the word cottage. Is that tongue-in-cheek? Is that, has the term evolved?
I should have defined that too. It's very much local jargon in Newport, and it was called Newport cottages in books. They started out as these very grand wooden cottages, and the great mansions locally were still referred to as cottages. The Breakers, the 70-room town palazzo, was the Vanderbilt cottage. Do you know there were no street addresses in Newport right up until the 1950s? You'd simply address it to the Breakers or the name of the house. That's in Newport was still an island. The bridges didn't come in. There was only one bridge right up until 1927. So it was a more isolated community. The 19th century lasted in Newport until Rhode Island until World War II, many people say.
What is the relationship of the college in Newport? Is it Salvagine? I don't know how you
Yes.
say that. And how do they interact with the rest of the town, and are they involved in some of the preservation, whether it's gardens or structures?
Very good point, because I addressed this in a paper I presented once for ICOMOS and UNESCO in Buenos Aires. I just wanted to go to Buenos Aires, to be honest. I really did. But when you think of this community, it's one of the most unsustainable communities, if you think about it. And Henry James was right, but he was wrong. Preservation Society was founded in 1945. It owns 11 historic properties as house museums. It really has been, in some ways, an accidental but fortuitous development of many organizations. Salve Regina owns Ochre Court, one of the great houses I showed you. They own 38 historic properties over time as part of their campus. There are still privately owned houses, though. Newport Restoration Foundation, created by Doris Duke in 1968, took over the 18th century city, 72 colonial houses restored, still owned by the foundation, maintained, but leased. So these were the important initiatives, and then there's been a great deal of private ownership, but that helps stabilize real estate values. But fashions change too. Newport is on the upswing. Housing prices still are not as high as, I'm not a real estate developer, but as the Hamptons, for example. The highest price paid in Newport was for Miramar about 10 years ago for $25 million, and they thought that was record-breaking, but it's much higher in other communities. So it's really the concerted effort. It's a private and public evolution that's really been key. They do work together, not all the time. Sometimes there are differences of opinion, but it's not particularly contentious. There's an issue of tourism in any community, though. How to control tourism. When is it too much? Cruise ships come into the harbor, they're immense. There's that concept. It's not overrun like Venice, but it's still an issue with a small city with a big cultural legacy. But Henry was right and he was wrong. They're not private residences, but adaptive reuse and preservation has really saved the day. Yeah.
Great. I think we have time for one more question in the audience.
What will it be? Let's see. Peter.
I thought I read that Olmsted only wanted to design in green and white, that he didn't believe in color, and yet I saw Olmsted color, so he must have been deferring to his clients.
Yeah, Peter asked, he thought Olmsted only wanted to design in green and white, he had heard, but he saw some with color. Well, he did use natural materials, but he did use some color because rhododendrons are in white, but they can be in rich colors as well. And I've seen the plant list. He did do 3 private estates and 1 park in Newport. His parks are green, very green. Trees, green shrubbery in general. It's true. But what's interesting about Olmsted, he would go on to design Biltmore with Richard Morris Hunt in North Carolina, a green forest, but there are great French parterres at that. And there were at Ochre Court. Now, those are his sons, but he collaborated with his sons, too. Part of it was client taste. The Olmsted brothers were adhering to changing tastes. So we know Olmsted for the picturesque, but it didn't mean he didn't adapt as well. He did it in a very disciplined way. And his landscapes are, even his classical landscapes, are greener than most. I must tell you, though, I've shown you flower gardens in Newport. Those were Olmsted brothers at the Brown estate, not the father. But you know, the Elms is very much a green landscape. If you go to Newport, there's a great deal of green. The flowers really in the cutting gardens were meant for the houses, where they had these enormous displays of flowers. One Newport resident, and again in her 90s, told me, when she was a young girl in the 20s, that she remembers at 5 a.m., she got up early one day, you had all these gardeners fanning out across Newport. And think of it, it wasn't one estate, there were 200. And Coggeshall Avenue was the street parallel to Bellevue Avenue, and you see, and they had horses going very slowly. They would rake the gravel, and the house owner would have to be the first one allowed to put a footprint on the raked gravel. And she remembers the landscapes being very green and the flowers inside magnificent. And many a Newport gardener were nationally renowned because they would win awards nationally for their flowers. For example, the Leeds family, who owned Rough Point for a while, later becoming famous as Doris Duke's house, that landscape was by Frederick Law Olmsted himself. It was all green, by the way, that one. But he won his award for sweet peas by the Sweet Pea Society, which displayed their work at the Museum of Natural History in New York. So we're talking about major performers, not servile, stewards of a single estate. These were powerful, talented characters. That's a whole culture that we didn't want to have lost. In Newport. I think it's interesting. One of the old estate gardeners, I went to see his wife, and she gave me photographs of him. It's very interesting. In his own house, he had asphalted the entire front lawn and had one incredible copper beech. And she said, he was just so tired when he got home at night. So I love that story as well. Yeah.
Great.
Is that
Thank
it?
you so much,
well,
Mr.
thank you so
Tschirch,
much,
for your
everyone.
fabulous presentation. As a reminder, you can find Mr. Tschirch's book in the museum store and join us outside for a book signing. Thank you and have a great